The upcoming board meeting of the Reserve Bank may be a stormy one, where recent government nominees to the Reserve Bank board may take up issues like transferring the Reserve Bank's capital or some of it to the government, easing the prompt corrective action rules that govern weak banks, and indeed Reserve Bank's application of the Basel rules to banks. But does the board have the power to direct the Reserve Bank governor on how much capital banks should maintain, for instance? Can the board vote and thus direct the governor? What are the powers of the board vis-a-vis the governor and his team? To guide us and the nation on all these questions, we have with us Mr. Y.H. Malegam, the nation's foremost chartered accountant, member of the Reserve Bank of India board for 17 years. It's actually its longest serving board member. And indeed, the regulator's go-to guy for practically all rule-making issues. Mr. Malegam headed the Mutual Fund Disclosure Rules Committee in 1996, if I'm not mistaken. He made the rules governing microfinance companies in 2009. He was asked by the government and the Reserve Bank in 2013 to determine how much capital the Reserve Bank should have. So, well, he has been there, done that, and he is with us today. Thank you very much, Mr. Malegam, for taking the trouble to come over to our studios. Well, the first, the question is on capital, since, it's in the air. Can the government ask for the Reserve Bank's capital?
As I understand it, the Act provides that all the surplus of the Reserve Bank in any particular year, the surplus profits, after making provision for those matters for which central banks make provisions, has to be transferred to the government. But there is no provision which says that any part of the reserves can be paid to the government. And therefore, at the most, the maximum which can be distributed is the surplus for the year without making any transfer to provisions.
Okay. There is, therefore, if something has to be transferred from yesteryear's reserves, as it were, retained profits, yes, you will have to amend the Act?
I think so.
Okay. Okay, now let me, you yourself were involved in once advising the Reserve Bank, yes, and the government on how much reserves the Reserve Bank should have. Can you take us through the argument? Because there is a Arvind Subramaniam argument.
Obviously, I can't tell you the details, sure, of that report, because that's not been made public.
Okay, okay.
But I can tell you the broad approach which was taken.
Sure.
The question is that the Reserve Bank, as has been made in the public domain, there was a report made earlier which said that the bank should build up reserves equivalent to 12% of its net worth. And gradually the Reserve Bank has been transferring these amounts to the reserves. What we had to look at was, are the reserves adequate for the risks which are attached to the bank in its operations? And we came to the conclusion, after identifying various risks, that the reserves at that point of time were adequate, and even maybe a little more than adequate. And therefore, we suggested that for the next 3 years, you don't add to the reserves and distribute all the profits which are there. And then at the end of 3 years, review the position again.
Which is what Raghuram Rajan did. In the 3 years he was governor, I think he transferred all the surplus, which was about 65,000 crores
I
each
don't know
year.
the figure.
No, I remember the numbers very well. It was between 60 and 65,000 crores. We can find it in the Reserve Bank Bulletin. Now, after 3 years, when Dr. Urjit Patel became governor, that was the year of demonetization.
Yes.
And therefore, the bank made fewer surpluses, lesser surpluses than previous years. But the governor also kept aside from whatever, a surplus of about 30,000 crores, he kept aside about 13,000 crore for contingency. Now, do you think he was right? After all, he was following the Malegam recommendation. For 3 years, the entire surplus has to be given. In the 4th year, he was right in keeping it.
As I said, the situation doesn't remain constant. So what is right or wrong will depend upon the circumstances at a particular point of time. One of the most important things to remember is that a substantial portion of the surplus which a Reserve Bank makes arises because of the revaluation of its foreign currency reserves. Now, these reserves are held in foreign currencies. So what would happen is that if the rupee depreciates, then to that extent, the value of that foreign investment goes up and it adds to the profits. These are unrealized gains. They could get reversed at some time in the future. And therefore, this gain is not, in fact, retained as a surplus, but is transferred to a reserve so that if and when the currency reverses the position and the rupee appreciates, then that amount of reserve can be utilized.
Well, so would it be right? I mean, when I looked at the last Reserve Bank balance sheet and accounts, it said that there are about 10 lakh crore of reserves, of which a little over 7 lakh crore is revaluation reserves and about 2.5 lakh crore are contingency fund and asset development fund. Now, would it be sound accounting standards not to touch the revaluation reserve when one is calculating the strength of the bank?
Obviously, because you cannot distribute unrealized gains, and that is a practice which most central banks follow. In fact, some years ago, the Central Bank of Israel is reputed to have distributed these unrealized gains, and subsequently the currency reversed, and they had a problem because then the gains which they had realized had to be reversed, but the money had already been paid out.
Okay, so negative reserves actually.
That's right.
Okay, so we ought not to go down that path.
That's right.
You know, there are others who have suggested that when you transfer all the reserves, all the surplus in a particular year to the government, it would be better to keep a little amount to smoothen out the dividend payments. I mean, there are various suggestions that come in terms of surpluses. Do you think what is called for today would be to appoint a committee with people like you to take a view for the next few years or for all time a dividend policy?
I don't think one can have a set percentage of profits which must be transferred to reserves, because as I said, whether reserves are adequate or not at a point of time depends upon the risks which are identified at that particular point of time. And you can appoint a committee, but internally also the Reserve Bank can make an assessment and say to what extent the reserves are adequate.
Okay.
That is opposed to the other proposition that you determine that for all points of time, 12% would be an adequate margin, that sort of a thing.
You think that's a good idea?
I personally prefer that it's in a volatile situation in which the Reserve Bank operates with currencies fluctuating quite a bit. It is much better to periodically review the position, look at what is available in terms of reserves, and then decide whether going forward you should add to those reserves or just eat into those reserves in the future.
Okay. No, the trouble appears to be that the government and the Reserve Bank have a different view on how much capital should be kept. After all, Arvind Subramanian said that the Reserve Bank was the most overcapitalized bank at 27%. He said the international average is 14%.
Well, you know, there are so many risks which cannot be identified in that particular fashion. For example, apart from this question of the exchange risk, there is the question of the risk that the Reserve Bank ultimately is the lender of the last resort. And a strong balance sheet also conveys a strong impression about the bank and in a way of the currency itself. So it's very difficult to decide this.
You know, Dr. Reddy in his autobiography, Advice and Dissent, and in his speeches, I guess, and Raghuram Rajan more recently, have said that, you know, India's rating is not AAA, the sovereign rating. but we ought to have an entity like the central bank with near AAA rating,
Yes.
so that when we have a problem, this entity can have swap lines or borrow. Is that a fair argument, you think?
It's a question of what is the probability factor which you assign to a risk. In a AAA rating, you might say that you want to cover a risk whereby you ensure that the risk will not materialize 99.9%.
Okay.
And you might say, well, all right, 95% is all right. But that's a matter of opinion.
Judgment.
But the fact still remains that whatever you do, the law does not permit you to distribute past reserves.
Okay. Well, that I think is a very important conclusion,
Yes.
and you know, it's something that the government needs to understand. And now, the last question on capital before I come to the board itself: can the board direct the Reserve Bank governor to transfer more surplus than he is prepared to, if in his assessment he thinks a part of it needs to be held back?
You know, I don't think the board can do that, because the board has to act in accordance with the law. If the act does not permit something, how can the board say you can do it?
This is interesting. What is really the powers of the Reserve Bank board is something we have never delved into. Mr. Malegam, we have to take a break. But after this break, I want to ask you exactly that. What are the powers of the Reserve Bank board? In what instances can it give directions to the governor? All those questions to Mr. Malegam in a minute after this break.